Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in your club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, 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 tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, 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 tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips. Tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, baby. Everybody wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody wants your tips, tips, baby. Everybody wants your tips, tips. Everybody wants your tips, 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 baby. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, 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 tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, tips, tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips, 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 tips. Everybody in the club wants your tips. Yeah, baby.